The sound of the classical flute is really quite a complex sound to simulate on a synthesizer. Aside from the sound itself, which is very harmonically complex, its sound is also affected greatly by the way it's played. And using a typical keyboard controller, it's not really realistic to try and attain the same degree of control over the sound as a trained musician could with a real flute. However, by keeping the control of the sound a lot more simplistic, a quite satisfactory or even sonically pleasing impersonation of the flute sound can be achieved. As with the pan flute sound that I created in an earlier video, this also consists of one VCO and again a square wave, combined with white noise. This time, instead of using the fixed filter bank, I tried to recreate the sound using the Gemini. The idea behind that is the Gemini has two fully functional voltage controlled filters. I'm using both filters to process two sounds independently, but with a dual output, so that I can benefit from the voltage controlled audio mix function. The first VCF is processing white noise, and I'm using the vary filter output, which has a variable mix of both low pass and high pass. In this case, I'm mostly using high pass because I don't want too much low frequency in the sound. Blending these two very different filters together creates quite a hollow sound and a lot of separation between the different frequencies, which I think simulates the sound of air passing through a flute a lot more realistically. So this is the sound of just the white noise going through the Gemini. Now this is the reason why I wanted to use the Gemini. Because it's voltage controlled, I can also send the 1 volt per octave signal from the keyboard to this filter. And if I have quite a high level of resonance, then the filtered noise will have its own pitch. As an optional extra, I'm also using the next phase. And the reason for that is that you can use this to sculpt the sound in the same way as a filter, but with more complex results. Because the next phase has so many possible combinations of phaser stages and emphasis stages, and because the frequency can be voltage controlled if necessary, it makes it a very powerful tool for sculpting the tone of a sound. And in this case, it just creates more harmonic complexity, and to my ears it makes it sound even more like the air passing through a flute. I also have the 1 volt per octave going to the next phase as well to control the frequency. I've tuned VCF1 to produce the same pitch as the VCO that's coming in. I'm making good use of the envelopes in this patch as well, because the first envelope over here is going to a multiple, and then it's modulating both the frequency of the second filter, which is processing the VCO, and it's also going to the mix CV. So it's, as the envelope is going through its cycle, it's moving the mix from the noise of VCF1 into the VCO on VCF2. And it's also connected to the pulse width modulation of the VCO as well. And the two of these elements added together, the filter and this VCO shape that I'm using, just helps to create that change in sound as the air is blown into the flute. I've got the mod output of the controller set to aftertouch, and that's indirectly going into the VCA of the tap tempo LFO. So as I add more pressure, it starts to add some LFO modulation. predominantly to this filter that's processing the VCO, but also a very subtle amount of pitch modulation to the VCO itself. And I've actually put the output from the modulation of the keyboard through the glide module just to smooth off the slightly edgy changes between the level of modulation. Because audio mix is being controlled by CV, this pot becomes an attenuator. But I can use this to govern how much eventual VCO that I'll have, so I can add more of it and completely remove the noise altogether. Or simulate a flute that's not being blown particularly hard, so that you can hear more of the breath and less of the note. The final envelope is for the VCA, and the settings on the two envelopes don't look too dissimilar, but this is a very subtle sound where just slight changes to envelope settings can make a big difference. Because the VCF envelope is also connected to the mix CV, then making the attack quicker or shorter will mean that the sound transitions from the noise to the VCO more quickly. If you was playing a piece where you were changing notes rapidly, this might be more suitable. I'm using the two separate outputs of the tap tempo LFO, and the unipolar output is going to the Gemini filter frequency for the second VCF. Because it's unipolar, that gives it a similar CV range as an envelope generator. So it's increasing the filter frequency from the setting that I have on the control to a higher level and then down again. Whereas for the pitch CV of the VCO, I'm using the bipolar output. So that's sending a CV signal of +5 to -5 volts, so that the pitch is modulating equally above and below the tuning of the VCO itself. Trying to simulate such a sound in a relatively simple analog monophonic synthesizer patch is pretty much impossible, but it's certainly possible to make a flute sound that's much more convincing than the early synthesizers of the 70s, which would often come with presets based on acoustic instruments, such as an ARP Pro Soloist or a Roland SH1000.